Sold into darkness as a poor omega, the captor shocked all by claiming her soul. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let's return to our main character. Elena Moore learned early that silence could be heavier than chains, heavier even than the night that swallowed the marketplace, where she stood waiting to be claimed by a future she had never chosen. She was small by any measure, barely 5'4", her boots worn thin at the soles, her coat borrowed and too large for her shoulders. And yet what made her invisible was not her size but the way people looked past her, as if hope itself had decided not to stop there. The air smelled of cold iron and rain, and lantern light painted the stone walls in dull gold, while voices rose and fell like distant waves, measuring worth in quiet tones that never included her name. Elena kept her eyes on the ground, counting breaths the way she had been taught. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, reminding herself that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing kindness even when choices had been taken away. Somewhere beyond the ring of light, a gate creaked open, and with it came a hush that felt deliberate, controlled, the kind that followed authority without needing to announce itself. She sensed him before she saw him, the man they called the captor, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because the space around him seemed to arrange itself, leaving room where room had not existed a moment before. Elena did not look up, not yet, but she felt the shift inside her chest, a steadying warmth that surprised her with its calm, as if a compass needle had quietly aligned. The transaction moved forward without ceremony, numbers spoken in low voices, a nod exchanged, a seal pressed, all of it efficient and clean, and when it was done, the world did not end the way she had feared. Instead, it narrowed. Footsteps approached and stopped at a respectful distance. No hand grabbed her arm. No command fell like a hammer. There was only a presence, patient and unreadable, and the sense that something unseen had paused to listen. Elena lifted her gaze just enough to see polished black boots and the hem of a long coat, the fabric moving with a slow certainty, and she realized that the darkness she had been sold into was not empty. It was attentive. She followed because there was nowhere else to go, because dignity sometimes meant walking forward even when the path was unlit, and because a quiet voice inside her whispered that this was not the end of her story. As they crossed the threshold into the waiting night, Elena felt the strange comfort of being seen without being consumed, and though she could not name it yet, a promise hovered between them, unspoken and binding, as steady as a heartbeat measured not in fear, but in resolve. The carriage moved through the night with a steady rhythm, wheels humming over stone and packed dirt as if the road itself knew where it was going. And Elena Moore sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling every turn through the subtle sway of her body rather than sight. The interior was clean and quiet, lit by a single lantern that did not flicker, and the silence felt intentional, not neglectful. Across from her sat Adrian Blackwood, his posture composed, his gaze angled toward the window as if the darkness outside carried information she could not read. No restraints held her, no instructions were given, and that absence unsettled her more than any threat could have. She measured time by the sound of her breathing and the distance between heartbeats, noticing how the tension she carried from the market slowly loosened, not because she felt safe, but because she felt observed in a way that did not strip her of herself. When the carriage finally slowed, the air changed, cooler and cleaner, scented with pine and rain, and Elena understood they had traveled miles beyond the city without her noticing the distance. The doors opened to reveal a stone courtyard framed by low walls and soft light, lanterns spaced evenly like a careful promise, and beyond them, a residence that was neither lavish nor harsh, built with proportion and patience. Adrian stepped out first and offered a simple gesture toward the entrance, not a command, and Elena followed, her steps quiet against the ground. Inside, the space opened into warmth, a fire burning low, shelves lined with books rather than trophies, and the sound of water somewhere nearby, steady and calm. This was not the darkness she had imagined. She was shown a room that belonged to her alone, a bed made with clean linens, a chair near the window, a pitcher of water, and a folded blanket placed with care. Adrian spoke then, his voice even and controlled, telling her that she would not be expected to serve or perform, that her needs would be met, and that questions could wait until morning. He did not linger. When the door closed, Elena stood still, absorbing the unfamiliar feeling of choice returning in small, cautious pieces. She washed her hands, the water warm, and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house breathe around her, the soft creak of wood, the distant hush of wind. Sleep did not come quickly. Thoughts gathered like clouds, and with them, the memory of the other Omegas she had seen, the way fear had lived in their shoulders, the way no one had stepped forward. She wondered why she had been brought here, what rule she had unknowingly satisfied, what expectation hovered just beyond her understanding. At some point, a subtle warmth settled behind her ribs, not excitement, not relief, but a quiet steadiness, as if something deep within her had recognized a pattern it trusted. Morning arrived gently, light spilling across the floor in pale gold, and with it came the realization that she had slept through the night without waking once. When she stepped into the hall, she found breakfast waiting, simple and nourishing, and Adrian seated at the table, reading, his presence calm and contained. He looked up and met her eyes, not with possession, but with acknowledgement, and in that moment, Elena felt the weight of her past loosen its grip just enough for her to breathe freely. Whatever this place was, whatever he intended, she sensed that her story had shifted, not into comfort, but into significance, and that the silence surrounding her now was not emptiness, but the space before a truth chose to speak. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, each morning arriving with the same soft certainty, and Elena more began to notice how the house responded to her presence as if it had been waiting. She learned the measure of the halls by walking them barefoot, the distance from her room to the kitchen just under 40 steps, the windows placed to catch the earliest light, the way the air warmed by late afternoon and cooled again after sunset. Adrian Blackwood remained a constant without intrusion, present at meals, absent when privacy was needed, his attention precise and restrained. He asked questions that did not pry and offered information without embellishment, explaining the boundaries of the estate, the schedule of the household, and the expectation that she would choose how to spend her time. Elena found herself drawn to small tasks, helping in the kitchen, tending to the garden beds along the eastern wall, listening more than speaking. It was there she met others, Omegas and staff who moved with quiet competence, their expressions cautious but not fearful, and she noticed how they watched Adrian when he passed, not with dread, but with a respect that suggested trust earned over time. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low and rain began to fall in a gentle, steady sheet, Elena sought shelter in the library, a room she had not yet explored fully. The shelves held volumes worn by use, margins marked by careful notes, histories and maps alongside poetry and philosophy, and she realized that whoever had built this place had valued continuity over conquest. Adrian entered without announcement and paused when he saw her reading, as if acknowledging a shared discovery. He spoke then of the land, of agreements kept and laws older than memory, of the responsibility that came with authority, and Elena listened, feeling the strange warmth return, a resonance she could not explain but did not fear. As he spoke, she sensed that he chose his words with intention, revealing just enough to test understanding without overwhelming it. Later that evening, a minor incident unfolded in the courtyard when a younger Omega faltered under pressure, overwhelmed by an expectation set too quickly. Elena stepped forward before thinking, offering calm guidance, a steady voice, a reminder that learning took time. The moment passed without consequence, but Adrian had seen it, his gaze sharpening not with disapproval, but with recognition. That night, Elena lay awake, aware of a subtle shift, a connection that felt less like a tether and more like alignment, as if two paths had begun to run parallel without crossing. In the days that followed, the sensation grew clearer, not demanding attention, simply present, a steady hum beneath her thoughts. Adrian, too, seemed affected, his pauses longer, his focus occasionally distant, as though listening to something beyond sound. When he finally addressed it, He did so with care, explaining that certain bonds were not formed by choice alone, that some were activated by acts of courage and compassion, by the willingness to stand when retreat would be easier. He did not name it. He did not claim it. He only acknowledged that something ancient had stirred, and that with it came responsibility rather than ownership. Elena absorbed this quietly, understanding that whatever was unfolding would not erase her past, but would ask her to carry it forward with purpose. As rain cleared and sunlight returned, she felt a growing certainty settle within her, not of safety, but of belonging to a story larger than survival, one that would test her resolve without diminishing her worth, and she knew that the darkness she had entered was not a prison, but a threshold. The change revealed itself during a gathering meant to be routine, a scheduled review in the South Hall where responsibilities were reassigned for the coming season, and Elena more attended because she had been asked, not summoned. The hall was long and measured, 40 yards end to end, with windows high enough to admit light without distraction, and the people present stood in respectful clusters, listening as names were called and tasks outlined. Elena stayed near the edge, hands loosely folded, observing the way tension gathered when expectations pressed too hard. When a young Omega named Clara hesitated after being assigned a duty beyond her current training, the room shifted almost imperceptibly, a collective holding of breath that anticipated correction. The steward overseeing the process spoke firmly, his tone efficient rather than unkind, but the effect was the same, and Clara's shoulders tightened as if bracing against a weight she could not yet carry. Elena felt the warmth behind her ribs brighten, not flaring, simply clarifying, and before she weighed the consequences, she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, respectful, offering a practical alternative that preserved the intent of the assignment, while adjusting its pace, a solution grounded in observation rather than challenge. The hall grew quiet, not because authority had been questioned, but because sense had entered the room. Clara looked up, relief softening her posture, and the steward paused, considering. Adrian Blackwood stood at the far end, listening without expression, his attention sharp and complete. The decision was made quickly, the adjustment approved, and the gathering moved on, but something fundamental had shifted. Afterward, in the corridor washed with afternoon light, Adrian approached Elena and acknowledged her action without praise or reprimand, asking instead how she had assessed the situation. She answered honestly, explaining what she had seen and why timing mattered, and he nodded once, accepting the reasoning as valid. That evening, word spread quietly, not as gossip, but as recognition, and Elena noticed how others met her gaze more readily, how questions came framed with trust rather than fear. Later, as dusk settled and lanterns were lit, Adrian invited Elena to walk the perimeter, a path just under a mile that traced the boundary between cultivated ground and forest edge. They walked side by side, the air cool and clear, and he spoke of leadership as a balance between structure and mercy, explaining that strength was measured not by pressure applied, but by resilience fostered. Elena listened, understanding that her action had been a test she had not known she was taking, one that had revealed alignment rather than defiance. As they returned, a subtle sensation gathered, a synchronized awareness that neither named, a quiet accord that felt less like agreement and more like recognition. That night, Elena dreamed not of the market or the road, but of standing in a field at first light, the ground firm beneath her feet, the horizon wide and unbroken. When she woke, the warmth remained, steady and composed, and she understood that the bond Adrian had referenced was no longer an abstraction. It was responding to choice, to courage expressed without spectacle, and to restraint practiced with care. In the days that followed, Elena was consulted more often, not elevated, but included, her perspective valued for its clarity. Adrian observed without interference, intervening only to ensure fairness, and when he finally addressed the growing awareness between them, he did so with precision, stating that certain declarations could not be made lightly, that when spoken, they reshaped lives and obligations beyond the walls of the estate. Elena accepted this without disappointment, sensing that what mattered was not the timing of words, but the integrity behind them, and as the season turned, she felt ready for whatever truth would require her to stand again, not in opposition, but in purpose. The turning point arrived without ceremony, announced not by raised voices but by the sudden precision of silence. And Elena Moore felt it before anyone spoke, a tightening of the air that sharpened attention across the estate. It began during a meeting with external representatives who had arrived to discuss seasonal agreements, their tone polite but edged with assumptions that had not been tested here before. Elena attended as an observer, positioned slightly behind Adrian Blackwood, listening as language skirted around respect without committing to it. When one representative referred to the Omegas present as interchangeable resources rather than individuals with roles and judgment, the room cooled perceptibly, and Elena sensed the warmth behind her ribs respond, not flaring, but clarifying like a compass needle snapping into place. She did not speak. She did not need to. Adrian set down his pen with deliberate care, the soft sound cutting through the conversation, and when he looked up, his gaze was calm, unwavering, and absolute. He issued a single directive, measured and precise, correcting the framing and establishing boundaries without hostility, stating clearly that no agreement here would proceed under language that diminished agency or worth. The representatives adjusted quickly, offering revised terms, and the meeting continued on different footing, the balance restored without spectacle. Later, as the hall emptied and the last footsteps faded, Adrian turned to Elena and asked her to walk with him. They moved into a smaller chamber where the light was lower and the walls carried the quiet weight of history, and he spoke with candor, acknowledging that what he had commanded had not been solely for policy, but in response to something deeper that had been steadily asserting itself. He explained that ancient bonds did not announce themselves with force, that they revealed their presence through alignment, through moments when authority and compassion converged without conflict. Elena listened, aware of the steady pulse that matched his cadence, not overwhelming, simply present, and she understood that the directive he had issued had been as much a recognition as a correction. He stopped then, meeting her eyes fully, and, for the first time, named the principle that had been circling them both, stating that when such a bond was recognized, it imposed obligations on the one with power first, requiring restraint, protection, and public clarity. He did not declare possession. He did not define the future. He stated a truth and waited. Elena felt the weight of that pause, the respect in it, and answered by affirming her own agency, acknowledging the bond as a shared responsibility rather than a claim to be taken. The warmth settled into something steady and composed, as if agreement had been reached at a level beneath words. In the days that followed, the estate adjusted subtly, protocols clarified, expectations refined, and Elena noticed how the staff responded to the shift, not with confusion, but with recognition, as if a missing note had finally resolved. Adrian's authority appeared unchanged, yet it carried a new transparency, and when he spoke, it was clear that his commands were grounded in accountability as much as command. One evening, as they stood overlooking the grounds, the lights tracing familiar paths below, Adrian stated plainly that there would come a moment when acknowledgement would need to be made publicly, not for sentiment, but for stability, because bonds left unspoken invited distortion. Elena accepted this with calm resolve, understanding that the path ahead would require her to stand not behind him, but beside him, visible and prepared. As night settled and the stars emerged, she felt neither fear nor anticipation dominate, only a clear sense of readiness, knowing that the directive that had changed the course of the day was not an end, but a threshold, and that when the time came to cross it, they would do so with intention rather than impulse. The realization arrived gradually, not as a revelation but as a pattern that refused to be ignored, and Elena Moore noticed it in the smallest details. The way her thoughts aligned with Adrian Blackwood's decisions before they were spoken, the way the house itself seemed to respond when they occupied the same space. It began one morning as they reviewed correspondence, standing opposite sides of a long table, when Elena anticipated a concern he had not yet voiced and addressed it calmly, earning a brief stillness that felt charged rather than awkward. Adrian regarded her with a measured look, not surprise, but recognition, as if a hypothesis had just proven itself. Throughout the day, the sensation repeated, a shared rhythm that required no exchange, and by evening, the air between them carried a clarity that demanded acknowledgement. They walked together along the western terrace as dusk settled, the sky deepening to blue, and Adrian spoke carefully, explaining that what they were experiencing matched accounts preserved in records older than the estate, descriptions of a resonance that surfaced when values, intent, and responsibility aligned across two individuals. He emphasized that such reactions were not ownership or obligation imposed by tradition, but evidence of mutual consent expressed through action rather than declaration. Elena listened, feeling the steady warmth affirm his words, understanding that what stirred within her was not surrender but expansion, a strengthening of self rather than a loss of it. As the days passed, the reaction intensified in ways both subtle and profound, a shared awareness that sharpened judgment and steadied resolve, allowing them to navigate challenges with an efficiency that felt almost intuitive. When disagreements arose among the staff, Elena found her perspective offered weight not because of position, but because it resonated with outcomes that served the whole. Adrian adjusted his directives with greater transparency, explaining the reasoning behind decisions, reinforcing trust without diminishing authority. The estate responded as a single organism, balanced and responsive, and those who observed sensed that a foundational alignment had been restored. One evening, during a gathering meant to reaffirm alliances, a moment arose that tested the unspoken bond. A guest, unfamiliar with the customs here, questioned Elena's presence beside Adrian, framing it as a temporary courtesy rather than a recognized role. The room held its breath. Elena did not react immediately. She felt the resonance steady her, not urging response, but patience, and before she spoke, Adrian addressed the implication with composed clarity, stating that her presence reflected a standing rooted in shared values and demonstrated judgment. His words were precise, not elevated, but they carried finality. Elena followed by articulating her commitment to the estate's principles, grounding her position in service rather than status. The exchange ended without conflict, the misunderstanding resolved through alignment rather than force. Later, alone in the quiet that followed, Elena reflected on the moment, realizing that the reaction between them had not overridden her voice, but amplified it, allowing her to stand fully without defensiveness. Adrian acknowledged this afterward, noting that the resonance strengthened when agency was honored on both sides, and cautioned that acknowledging it publicly would invite scrutiny that required readiness. Elena accepted this, recognizing that the reaction was not a shortcut, but a responsibility that demanded discipline. As the season advanced and the estate prepared for broader engagement beyond its walls, the resonance settled into constancy, no longer novel, but foundational. Elena felt neither urgency nor fear, only a composed certainty that whatever declaration lay ahead would be shaped by consent and clarity rather than impulse. In the quiet moments before sleep, she recognized that the reaction had not changed who she was, but had revealed who she had always been capable of becoming, and that realization grounded her with a confidence that did not seek permission to exist. The moment arrived not with spectacle but with inevitability, unfolding during a convocation that drew representatives from across the region to reaffirm commitments and witness the estate's direction for the coming year, and Elena Moore stood beside Adrian Blackwood because the agenda required clarity. The hall filled steadily, the measured hum of conversation settling into attentive quiet as Adrian took his place, his presence composed and exact, the room aligning around him without instruction. Elena felt the resonance steady and present, not urging haste, simply anchoring her as eyes shifted and assumptions surfaced in careful glances. When proceedings began, the language was formal and precise, affirmations exchanged, responsibilities named, until a question surfaced that sought to define Elena's role as provisional, a phrasing polite enough to pass in lesser rooms, but inaccurate here. The air held. Elena did not step back. She did not step forward. She remained exactly where she was, grounded, prepared to speak if needed, yet content to allow truth to surface on its own terms. Adrian listened without interruption, then rose, the motion unhurried, his voice carrying without strain as he corrected the framing with deliberate calm. He stated that provisional arrangements applied to tasks, not to bonds formed through consent and demonstrated alignment, and that what had been recognized privately would now be acknowledged openly to prevent distortion. The room stilled completely. He continued, explaining that Elena more stood with him not by favor or transaction, but by mutual recognition of values and responsibility, and that the bond between them was one that bound intention and accountability at the level of the soul, obligating protection, transparency, and shared stewardship. He did not elevate his tone. He did not invoke threat. He spoke as one stating a fact that required no defense. Elena felt the resonance expand, not consuming, but affirming, and when she spoke, her words were measured and clear, accepting the acknowledgement with equal weight, affirming her agency and her commitment to serve the whole without diminishing herself. The effect was immediate and profound, not applause, not murmurs, but a collective recalibration as those present adjusted their understanding to the reality now articulated. Questions followed, practical rather than probing, and answers were given with consistency, each reinforcing that the claim made was not possession, but covenant, not secrecy, but clarity. As the convocation concluded, individuals approached with renewed respect, not toward Elena alone, but toward the alignment they had witnessed, recognizing stability when it presented itself plainly. Later, in the quiet that followed, Adrian and Elena walked the familiar perimeter, the evening cool and steady, and Adrian acknowledged the weight of what had been declared, noting that such claims reshaped expectations beyond the estate's walls. Elena accepted this without hesitation, understanding that the shock lay not in the declaration itself, but in the way it redefined power as something accountable rather than extractive. As lights traced the paths below and the stars emerged overhead, the resonance settled into a composed constancy, no longer something that waited to be named, but a reality now shared openly, and Elena knew that the darkness she had entered long ago had been transformed not by escape, but by a truth spoken at the right moment, with precision, respect, and unwavering intent. In the days following the convocation, the estate did not retreat into secrecy, but expanded into purpose, and Elena more felt the shift as a widening rather than a tightening, as if the truth spoken aloud had allowed the structure itself to breathe. Delegations arrived with revised correspondence, requests framed with greater precision, and it became clear that the acknowledgement had activated protocols long dormant, pathways reserved for a level of authority rarely exercised openly. Adrian Blackwood addressed these matters with his usual restraint, but one evening, as they reviewed a sealed archive in the study, he paused and chose clarity over convenience. He explained that the authority recognized by those present at the convocation extended beyond regional stewardship, that the estate was not merely an independent domain but a keystone within a broader order governed by covenants older than recorded law. Elena listened, aware that the resonance remained steady, receptive, not alarmed, as Adrian disclosed that his role had been deliberately understated for years to prevent misuse, that the title he bore privately carried obligations that reshaped governance across territories. He did not dramatize it. He stated that he was the Alpha King, entrusted with oversight that balanced autonomy with protection, and that the declaration made publicly had effectively reactivated that recognition beyond these walls. Elena absorbed this with composed attention, understanding that the revelation did not alter the man she knew, but clarified the scope of his responsibility. Adrian emphasized that such authority was constrained by consent, that power exercised without alignment eroded legitimacy, and that the bond they shared functioned as a safeguard, ensuring accountability through shared values rather than dominance. As he spoke, Elena recognized how her experiences had prepared her to stand within this truth, not as an accessory to power, but as a counterweight that preserved its integrity. Over the following week, confirmations arrived, acknowledgments bearing seals and language that recognized the restored order, and Elena observed how the estate responded with quiet efficiency, systems adjusting without upheaval. She participated in consultations that addressed logistics and ethics, her voice carrying not because of proximity, but because it grounded decisions in lived consequence. When questions arose about precedent, Adrian deferred to principles rather than tradition, and Elena articulated the human impact with clarity, reinforcing that the authority revealed was not an escalation, but a return to balance. One afternoon, as they stood overlooking the lower fields, Adrian stated plainly that the claim he had made bound his soul to hers not as ownership, but as covenant, one that required transparency and mutual consent at every turn. Elena affirmed this, stating her understanding that the bond elevated responsibility rather than erased independence, and the resonance settled into a calm assurance, neither demanding nor withholding. As word spread beyond the immediate circle, reactions varied, but the estate remained steady, a visible example of power exercised with restraint. Elena found that the knowledge of Adrian's true role did not intimidate her, but clarified the stakes, and she felt prepared to meet them without sacrificing herself. The revelation concluded not with ceremony, but with resolve, as both acknowledged that the path ahead would test clarity as much as courage, and that the strength of their alignment would be measured not by declarations made, but by choices sustained. As evening light softened the grounds and the first stars appeared, Elena understood that the darkness she had once been sold into had become a vantage point, allowing her to see the structure beneath the world and to stand within it, steady, seen, and unafraid. The future did not arrive as a promise, but as a horizon that asked to be met, and Elena Moore stood at the threshold of it with a calm she had earned rather than borrowed. In the weeks after the revelation, the estate settled into a steady cadence, alliances reaffirmed through action rather than proclamation, and the work of stewardship deepened with intention. Elena moved through her days with clarity, meeting councils, listening to concerns, shaping responses that honored both structure and lived consequence. And she felt the resonance not as pressure but as balance, a shared steadiness that anchored her voice without overshadowing it. Adrian Blackwood carried the weight of his role with the same restraint she had come to trust, making decisions that favored durability over display, and when he spoke publicly, he did so with precision, grounding authority in accountability. Together, they set standards that did not rely on fear, clarifying that protection required transparency, and that loyalty followed fairness rather than command. As the estate prepared to engage beyond its borders, Elena recognized the scale of what lay ahead, not as an abstract challenge, but as a series of choices that would test resolve, empathy, and discipline. One evening, as they walked the familiar perimeter under a sky scattered with stars, Adrian asked a question that held no assumption, inviting her to define the role she wished to shape moving forward. Elena answered without hesitation, stating that she would stand as a steward of consequence, ensuring that decisions reflected the realities of those most affected, and that she would not relinquish her independence to symbolism. Adrian accepted this with a quiet nod, acknowledging that the strength of their covenant lay in consent renewed through action. In the days that followed, Elena encountered resistance and skepticism beyond the estate, framed politely but rooted in old expectations, and she met them with patience and clarity, refusing to diminish herself to satisfy tradition. Each exchange refined her understanding, and she learned that respect, once earned, did not need to be demanded again. The resonance remained steady, neither flaring nor fading, a constant reminder that alignment was maintained through choice. When the time came to address the broader assembly, Elena spoke plainly, recounting her journey without embellishment, stating that being sold had taught her the cost of silence, and that being claimed through covenant had taught her the power of consent. She articulated a vision where authority served as a safeguard rather than a threat, where bonds elevated responsibility instead of erasing agency. The response was not uniform, but it was real, and it marked the beginning of a recalibration that would take time to complete. As night settled and the assembly dispersed, Elena returned to the quiet of the estate, reflecting on the path that had brought her here. She understood that what had once been darkness had become context, giving shape to a resolve that could not be shaken by uncertainty. Standing beside Adrian, she felt neither owned nor overshadowed, but recognized, her soul aligned by choice rather than circumstance. The story did not end with certainty, but with readiness, and Elena embraced that truth fully, knowing that the beginning she had feared had become a foundation, and that the life ahead would be built not on what was taken from her, but on what she had chosen to claim for herself.